An Israeli air raid targeted positions right behind him, striking residential buildings near the Kuwait hospital in the southern city of Rafah. 4 people were killed and dozens injured in the strike. Let's replay the moment.
The remaining population in the area gets to be displaced, and this is the tragedy of every airstrike, causing more problem and forcing more Palestinian displacement, which can, of course, mount the pressure on healthcare facility as well as evacuation zone as we're getting into. Oh my God, did you hear that? Oh my God. That's the hospital, that's the hospital, that's the hospital. Oh my God. Are you guys hearing that? Are you guys hearing this? All the debris. Wait. Oh my God. No, this is really bad. This is bad. Are you guys seeing this? This is right behind the hospital right now. Oh my God. Listen يا بابا لا حبيبي. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Are you guys seeing? Yes, as you see, this is a huge dark cloud of smoke. This is what we were expecting. For 5 days, this drone did not leave the sky of this area, flying at a low level, and I think it was marking a target of more residential homes. People now are rushing to the site to see if there are people. I guess we're looking at a tragedy right now. It's causing a chaos. You see people are running away from the site of the explosion. There were multiple massive airstrikes right at the vicinity of the Kuwaiti hospital. You see people are panicking. They can't even walk. This is really bad. This is, you see, people are rushing now down the road. This is multiple residential homes, and we're hearing that there were people inside those homes that were targeted. There are homes. These were homes full of evacuees and displaced Palestinians. At this particular location, more than 3 residential homes completely destroyed. See, this is exactly what we've been talking about. There is no safe place in Gaza at all. No safe place in Gaza. no place more safe than the other. Even the vicinity of this hospital, this small-sized hospital, became a target of those relentless airstrikes. That's exactly what we describe. Every word describing these airstrikes being relentless, aggressive, brutal.
Sabrine says she is struggling to recover after being shot by an Israeli soldier. She was one of only 3 female paramedics working with ambulance crews in the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. And this is the moment the bullet smashed through the ambulance's back door and ripped into her back, narrowly missing her spine.
I was trying to help the injured and I thought I was safe because I was inside the ambulance. When the first bullet hit me, the pain was incredible. As I lost consciousness, all I could think about was my daughters.
Palestinian medics are in danger more than ever before since the beginning of the war. Do you want to film inside? This medic asks Israeli soldiers who have blocked his path. The Israeli army are stopping Palestinian medics reaching or transporting the wounded, often threatening them at gunpoint, threatening their lives as they try to save the lives of others. Mahmoud Asadi still suffers pain from the burn injuries he suffered 20 years ago when this ambulance he was working in was attacked by the Israeli army.
The violations are worse now because they are more violent since the war started. The soldiers force medics out of the ambulances and strip search them, ordering them on their knees at gunpoint. They train their guns' laser sights on our chests as a direct threat, and they push the ambulances out of the area by using their military vehicles.
This ambulance is riddled with bullet holes. You don't get much clearer evidence than this that the Israeli army is targeting medical teams as it tries to get to and treat the wounded. There's another hole here, there's a couple here, there's an exit hole here where a bullet has come right the way through the vehicle. And there's another one here on the back door. Medical teams tell us that despite putting in repeated official complaints to the Israeli army, they have had zero response. This is an Israeli armoured bulldozer at the gates of one of Jenin's hospitals. Doctors say the Israeli army surrounds all 3 of the city's government hospitals during its almost nightly raids, hunting members of the Palestinian armed resistance.
They surround us and stop the ambulances from reaching us or leaving. They stop the doctors from doing their jobs. The hospital has been hit by tear gas, during which staff and patients inside suffered gas inhalation.
Sabrine says she wants to go back to work, but shrapnel is still stuck close to her spine and she needs another operation. But she says she is scared because her injury means she won't be able to save lives as well as she did before. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Jenin, the occupied West Bank.
You may have heard this story over the course of the weekend. In Gaza, 3 hostages emerged from a building. They were carrying a makeshift white flag. They had also attempted to create a sign with food saying that they were hostages. And
help 3 hostages was reportedly painted in Hebrew on the flag as well.
And they were shot immediately as they came out with the white flag. They had their shirts off so they could show that there were no bombs attached to their chest. They were shot, and apparently the only reason why they found out that they were hostages, and the reason why they checked, was one of them, at least, appeared more supposedly Western. And specifically, one of them had longer, and this is according to NBC News, long ginger hair and blue eyes. This is what stopped the Israeli soldiers to check on their identities.
And at least this person, Haim, the redheaded person, was supposed to perform in the at the festival where the hostages
were. At a music festival in Tel Aviv.
Oh, not the same one?
Different one.
Okay, so I
guess. But yeah, but they weren't. None of the three, as far as I can tell, were part of the IDF when they were taken hostage.
Okay, so they were civilian hostages, and the IDF shot them dead, despite them not wearing shirts, despite them holding their hands up in the air, waving white flags. And in addition to this obviously being an outrage in Israel, where presumably the failure of Hamas to release the hostages is part of the justification for this massive assault. But what it really goes to the heart of is if this is the way they are treating civilians or just people who have their shirts off and a white flag in the air, people who are actively both aware of the way the IDF might approach them, which is why they took their shirts off. They were savvy enough to know that. They apparently one of the guys who was killed ran back in, or attempted to run back into the building, yelling Hebrew. And if this is the way that they treat people who with a white flag and their shirts off, who are they not shooting? We're told time and time again that the Israeli military, unlike any other military in the history of all war, treats civilians with special care. Yet tens of thousands, or 20,000 dead in bombing
in 10 weeks.
98,000 buildings leveled. And when they're hand-to-hand battle, right, which we were told specifically, we're doing this because we want to protect civilians. And these people are summarily shot. And the only reason why we heard this story, let's be clear, is because one of the victims had red hair. And it caused them to think, hey, wait a second. This isn't one of the typical people that we shoot.
Yeah. They didn't have plausible deniability in that point, especially because it was on the ground. There will be undoubtedly hostages that are killed in the bombing, but those will be blamed on Hamas because it won't have been from the gun of an IDF soldier. I just sent this just because I want to put into context. Israel has a history of shooting civilians who are holding white flags. This is from Human Rights Watch in 2009, where they documented 7 instances where Israeli soldiers fired on civilians with small arms during an operation in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, 2 months, December 2008 and 2009. These attacks killed 11 civilians, including 5 women and 4 children, and wounded at least another 8. In each case, the victims were standing, walking, or in a slowly moving vehicle with other unarmed children who were trying to convey their non-combatant status by waving a white flag. And I wanted to clarify if all of these instances, if you could go to the next screenshot, were instances where they were waving a white flag, and according to Human Rights Watch in 2009, that's the case. They found no evidence that the civilian victims were used by Palestinian fighters as human shields, you can hear that language again, or were shot in the crossfire between opposing forces. In each of the 7 cases, at least one person was waving an improvised white flag made from cloth or clothes, which international humanitarian law recognizes as a sign of truce or surrender, meaning the IDF has encountered Palestinians with white flags before, and it doesn't matter to them whatsoever. They'll kill them regardless, and that's why they shot these people who ended up being Israeli hostages.
And to be clear, you will definitely hear the excuse that, well, Hamas has in the past used white flags to trick the IDF. So far, in all the reporting I've heard of that being an excuse floated, there has been no details to flesh out that report. Nevertheless, if it is the case that they're going to shoot people even with white flags, the even part is relevant. They're just shooting whoever they see. Now, maybe, if that person looks young enough, but we know that the IDF has a history of shooting children who, supposedly were throwing rocks at them or something to that effect. But it should give you a sense of the parameters in which they're engaging in these things. And yes, I imagine in battle there is you are trigger happy in certain instances. But the fact is that you can't then go and say we're taking extra precautions to protect citizens and that these numbers are fake and all these things when you're gunning down people who had the best possible knowledge one could have in how to approach the IDF in that situation, and they still were shot dead.
Yeah.
But here is Benjamin Netanyahu. He's at a news conference. This is in Hebrew, but there's translation. He is asked.
We don't have that question, unfortunately.
We don't have the question, but this clip is supposedly in response to a question about the killing, the Israeli killing of these hostages, and he immediately pivots to this. I am proud to have prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state because today everyone knows what a Palestinian state could have been after the war. The little Palestinian state in Gaza, everyone knows what could have been if we had succumbed to international pressure and allowed for a state like that in Judea and Samaria, that's the West Bank, around Jerusalem and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So to be clear, this guy's bragging that his career, 25 years worth of plus of being a politician, and a military one prior to that, maybe 30 years now, 40 years of being a politician, has been dedicated to preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. So when we hear, or we don't hear it anymore because they don't even bother, there's no one to negotiate with across the table. Understand, that was always disingenuous.
The United Nations General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. In Tuesday's vote, 153 nations approved the resolution, 23 abstained, just 10, including the U.S. and Israel, voted no. Though non-binding, the UN vote is another indication of the mounting isolation of the United States as it continues to support Israel's assault, which has killed over 18,000 Palestinians in a little over 2 months. The vote came just days after the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, President Biden's delivered his sharpest criticism yet of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. During a donor event in Washington, D.C., Biden criticized what he called Israel's, quote, indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. In a moment, we'll be joined by the Palestinian UN diplomat, Nada Tarbush. But first, let's turn to a speech he gave in November at the UN in Geneva. It went viral.
Israel said something that should make all of you shudder. It effectively said, I can kill any and every person in Gaza. The 2.3 million people in Gaza are either terrorists or terrorist sympathizers or human shields, and are therefore legitimate targets. Every person, according to Israel, falls into one of these three categories: a child, a journalist, a doctor, a UN staff, a newborn baby in an incubator. And so, according to Israel, it can kill them and then have the audacity to come to this room and tell the world with a straight face, we are acting in accordance with international law. The death of each of the over 11,350 people killed over the past month, be it children, journalists, UN staff, the sick, the elderly, according to Israel, was justified. Think about that for a moment and let it give you pause. Anyone anyone espousing this warped logic has no shred of humanity, no sense of morality, and no knowledge of legality. But guess what? Your carpet explanation for carpet bombing will not fly. People are not fools. The people in this room are seasoned diplomats who are well-read, have a knowledge of history, and many of whom have seen your government make the same arguments during your 6 previous military aggressions on Gaza in the past 15 years. They have seen you resort to collective punishment, targeting of Palestinian children, journalists, medical staff, aid workers before. They have seen you forcibly transfer our communities, colonize our lands, demolish our homes, and evict families from their own properties since the 7th of October and for the 75 years that preceded it.
That was Palestinian UN diplomat Nada Tarbush speaking November 17th, almost a month ago. At the time, the death toll in Gaza from Israel's assault was about 11,000. Today, it's over 18,600.
Why are there still well-known people supporting Israel's special military right to exist genocide operation against Gaza? Well, some of these B-through-D listers are simply dumb, confused, or misinformed, but some are all three at once. Yet to figure out why so many influencers support these primetime crimes against humanity, you have to follow the money. Celebrities and influencers have come out of the woodwork to support Israel. But they aren't bad people, they're just germaphobes who endorse all kinds of cleansing, especially ethnic. The celebrities include Chuck Schumer's second cousin, IDF Wonder Woman, that woman does make you wonder, and Jerry Seinfeld. What's the deal with that guy? I don't know about you, but I like to take my moral cues from a guy who dated a 17-year-old when he was 38. Not that there's anything wrong with that, except laws. But believe it or not, there are anti-Zionist Jews in the world. Zionist and Jewish are not the same thing. In fact, there are more Christian Zionists in the US than there are Jews in the world. Like, literally. Of course, many of those Christians believe we Jews need to be in Israel to bring about the end times, at which time they believe we'll burn in hell. But they want us to burn in hell in the best possible way.
For all eternity.
I guess I had a different plan for eternity. I thought I'd be single, I guess.
I'm sorry.
Anyway, many of the other influencers supporting Israel are actually being paid to do so. We have no idea how many influencers actually took the $5 grand deal, but we do know some of the ones who didn't.
I will not sell on Palestinians for any amount of money. You cannot buy my support of a genocide. This is disgusting.
Then there's the $250 that was offered to each college student who would show up to the recent pro-apartheid, I don't really understand things, but I can hold up this poster rally in Washington, D.C. And when I was a college kid, $250 sounded like more money than God has. Turns out that's actually a misconception. God doesn't have that much. He busts his tables at Applebee's for reject breadsticks.
How intelligent do you have to be to take a food order? Jesus.
Ma'am, you're absolutely right, and I apologize.
Anyway, those college kids were paid off by the Israel On Campus Coalition, a little-known organization with links to Israeli intelligence. But then there's an even bigger kind of influencer, Congress. In the Senate, they voted 97-0, and in the House, 412-1 to support Israel. But that word support, that's a bit of a stretch. It's like if you helped your friend Andy push a dead body into a wood chipper and then you told your wife you were out late because you were supporting Andy.
Let me go get help.
But 97-0, talk about a landslide. And that's despite the fact 2/3 of Americans want a permanent ceasefire. You see, many Congress people are funded throughout their careers by Israel's lobbying firms, including J Street, Pro-Israel America, Republican Jewish Coalition, AIPAC, NORPAC, and Fanny Pack. I might have made up that last one.
Huh?
So let's see, who is the senator or former senator who has received the most money from the Israel lobby?
Who's that war criminal?
Genocide Joe Biden.
Come on, man.
And number 3 on the list is our good friend Hillary Clinton, who has wholly endorsed bombing children and hospitals. She rarely even asks which children. Number 6 and 7 on the list are Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. Mitch, what are you thinking?
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Never mind. And 2 of the current members of the House of Representatives receiving loads from the Israel lobby are Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries.
Israel today, Israel tomorrow, Israel forever. God bless you.
Point being, the U.S. federal government on both sides is bought out or heavily funded by the Israel lobby. Do you think that influences their stances? Does a ventriloquist influence his doll?
Get your loser hand out of my ass.
But it's not just the politicians the Israel lobby supports, it's also who they oppose and how they sink anyone who dare criticize the apartheid state. Representative Rashida Tlaib is the only Palestinian American in Congress. Therefore, Israel wants her in Congress less than Star Wars fans wanted Jar Jar Binks. So Congress voted to censure her for daring to be Palestinian, but that's not where it stopped.
I was offered $20 million to withdraw from the senatorial race and run against my friend Rashida Tlaib.
$20 million? That's insane that he turned that down. I would run against my own mother for $20 million. I might even run over my own mother for that kind of money. I'm kidding, Ma. But with 20 mil, I could totally buy a new Ma.
It's another pain in the ass.
Now you may be thinking, $20 million sounds like a little more than the maximum $3,300 that you're allowed to donate to any candidate. No, $3,300 is the limit for a campaign contribution. This was a bribe. It's a completely different thing.
Look, Burns, this is a big problem. You just can't throw money at it and make it go away.
Gentlemen, I've decided there will be no investigation. Now, if you excuse me, I'll go away.
And that's not all. AIPAC has promised to spend $100 million to unseat anyone who's critical of Israel's crimes. They just said that publicly. Could you imagine the outrage if another group said that? Like the KKK or sex traffickers or people who design escape rooms in such a way that you never speak to your sister-in-law again?
Stop! Stop the game! She's gonna fall! Let her in! You guys have to...
If any of them spent $100 million to silence critics, the nation would be furious. But when it's AIPAC, we call it a healthy democracy. So if a celebrity or influencer supports Israel's atrocities, then not only are they not punished for it, some are even paid to do it. But if you're a celebrity with a moral core larger than a tardigrade who is standing against genocide, you'll likely be suppressed, like me, or worse, like Susan Sarandon, who was dropped by her talent agency, or actress Melissa Barrera, who lost her role in the Scream movies for Instagram posts about Israel.
No. Do you condemn Hamas?
Then, Newsweek ran a guilt by association article where they listed the celebrities supporting Sarandon, including some maniac named Lee Camp. I don't know who he is, but his name sounds like a halfway house for Civil War reenactors. Look, in a perfect world, no one supports mass atrocities. No one supports bombing hospitals and schools and bakeries and journalists. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in an awful one with salmon-colored pants and Michael Bay movies and a U.S. government completely bought out by the Israel lobby. Now they're working on buying out the entirety of the message on social media. Don't let it happen. This genocide has to stop.
I mean, you talk about, I've seen you reference, many times, revealed preference in terms of, particularly in terms of the United States. Because we have now I don't know, we're on sternly lettered word letter, sternly worded letter number 5 from Anthony Blinken about civilian casualties. How much of what do you think is happening? And I should also say, as we're talking, I recall now, I think it was a 2020 piece that you wrote about Joe Biden's relationship, troubling relationship in terms of Israel. How much of what we are seeing is just pure ideology from the U.S., from the Biden administration, maybe even just Biden himself? And how much of it is somewhat strategic? Because it seems like he has no awareness of what is going on the ground.
Israel in the United States is not really a foreign policy issue. It's in large measure an identity issue. And that is because Israel's founding myths are very similar to America's founding myths. One of the things that historians of the 19th century note is that the closer that American settlers were to the Indian frontier, the more likely they were to give their towns Old Testament names. Right. So that's why when my kids go to Jewish day school, so they have a familiarity with the Hebrew Bible. So when we were driving around the kids, they were constantly noticing the names of small towns in America that come from Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible. America and Israel both founded as promised lands on a hostile frontier. Right. So if you want to know how an American feels about Israel, just ask them how they feel about America's founding myths. The Americans who are most invested in those founding myths are the most pro-Israel. In fact, they see Israel in many ways, the Republicans, as a better version of America because it's more religious. It has clearer hierarchies. It has a stronger border policy. If you want to ask an American what they think of the 1619 Project, and you'll know what they think about Israel-Palestine, right? And so I think fundamentally the issue for Joe Biden, I think, is that much less than someone like Barack Obama or others in the Democratic Party, he is not really comfortable challenging these myths about America. And therefore, he doesn't really, I don't think he has a real understanding or real empathy of the Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian struggle is very threatening for Americans, in large measure, I think in part because if Americans were to become more conscious about it and they would think about a challenge to settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine, they might think about the fact that actually that challenge is very uncomfortable for us. Right. I think that's at the root of a lot of this.
It has always been my contention that the inverse is also true. That in founding Israel and in dealing with the question of settler colonialism and what will we do with the Palestinians, that they looked to America and said, well, Americans got away with it.
You don't have a leg to stand on.
And that it was just a question of we were just 100 years too late in terms of where society has progressed in terms of what we think about these things.
100%. So white South Africans said exactly the same thing, right? We haven't been as successful as you. And so in some ways, one way you could think about what's happening now is the question is it possible to do in the 21st century what it was possible to do hundreds of years ago, which is essentially a referendum on human moral progress, right?
Right.
Do we have this arc of history that Martin Luther King and Barack Obama like to talk about, or is that just an illusion? And I think that's part of what's at stake in this moment.
Well, let's talk about, because I think Joe Biden is going to be the last Democratic president to have this type of position. I just don't think that I think the writing has been on the wall. When Tim Kaine didn't, refuse to go to see Netanyahu speak, however many years ago that was, I was like, we're heading into a different era in terms of American politics. With that said, let's turn to this question that you wrote about in Jewish Currents. It was more specifically about the universities, but that's where what's on the stage today. You've written that this question of equating anti-Zionism or critique of Israel with anti-Semitism is not necessarily a conspiracy, I think you wrote, but a certainly aligned interest in avoiding certain conversations in certain areas in this country. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's among young people that this sense of identification with Palestine, right? And that word, I think, has taken on a particular centrality. is strongest, right? And these are the same kinds of people that would have been in the streets fighting against apartheid in the 1980s or fighting Vietnam. But I mean, we've seen these kind of moments before, where some kind of issue around the world becomes part of American progressive identity. Because it says it has a reflection of kind of what we're struggling for in the United States. We're in a death battle here for the question of whether this is going to be an ethno-state or whether it's going to be a state that tries to create equality under the law. And so people who are invested on the other side of this look at universities, especially elite universities, the universities they may have gone to, and they're really scared because they think these guys are going to be the next leaders of America. And I think tragically and unfortunately, for a certain group of people in the American Jewish establishment, it is imagined as essentially these were institutions where we felt comfortable. These were our institutions. We felt so proud of our role in these institutions as part of our success in America. And now they're being taken from us. Now we're becoming marginalized. Now we're becoming hated, right? And the problem is, what we need to remember, and I'm gonna, is the kind of things that people like, you may be surprised to hear me, like Barry Weiss and Bret Stephens used to say, right? They used to say this, they would say, there's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable at a university because people say things that are intellectually challenging to the points of view that you were raised with, right? That was the message to Black people. That's the message to LGBT people, right? That physical threats and harassment are one thing, and they're wrong and they're intolerable. But intellectual discomfort is part of learning, right? So, but when it comes to Jewish kids, right, the message is exactly the opposite, right? The message is if you are hearing things at universities that are scary and difficult for you because they really threaten the notion of Israel that you were raised with, then what we need to do is shut that speech down, right? And that's crazy. The answer should be that the American Jewish community has failed in our institutions, in our synagogues, in our Hebrew schools, in our Jewish day schools, in our camp. We have failed in that educational process because a lot of Jewish kids don't grow up with any actual interaction with Palestinians, never read a book by a Palestinian or seen a film by a Palestinian. So yeah, they're threatened when they hear Israel called an apartheid, settler, colonial, blah, blah, blah. But that's because they haven't actually had to engage with those issues, and we should encourage them to engage with those issues. And the irony is, then I'll stop, is that you have some American Jewish kids on the left who actually have undergone that process. And the process of transformation actually comes quite quickly, right? And they're with the pro-Palestinian protesters. And so then when you want to shut that protest down, you end up actually shutting those Jewish kids on the left down too, right? So their safety evidently doesn't matter so much. You can ban a Jewish Voice for Peace chapter in Columbia or suspend it, and no one says that's actually harming Jewish people.
Well, they're an inconvenient truth, I would say, or they're an inconvenience for like the Israeli project. And just to ask you a little bit more about the generational divide here, there was a poll that came out in the New York Times today about which side in the conflict between Israel and Palestinians do folks sympathize with more. And you're seeing just a complete sea change in people under the age of 29 in their sympathy with the Palestinian people. But that also falls along racial lines to a certain degree, where Black and Hispanic people tend to be more sympathetic with the Palestinian cause.
Yes.
What's your assessment of that?
I think, again, it goes back to these questions of America's founding myths and one's relationship to those things, right? If Ta-Nehisi Coates had this really remarkable line, and his entrance into this conversation itself is very telling, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates said, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East in exactly the same way that America is the oldest democracy in the world, right? So if you can say, if you raise your eyebrow when someone says that America is the oldest democracy in the world because you recognize that it wasn't a democracy for people like you, right? You will probably have exactly the same reaction when people say that about Israel. And that's what we're seeing. Now, unfortunately, in American foreign policy discussions, Black people, Hispanic people tend to be very underrepresented, right? So the American foreign policy discourse remains very, very, very white, which is why I think that these kind of this discourse that we're seeing isn't very well reflected in kind of establishment foreign policy discourse. But I think that's the reason for this shift. And, people often say, what do these kids know about, the truth is that we all work by analogy. It's hardwired into us to work by analogy. And the analogies for people who have had family experiences of either colonialism or segregation, just being in a situation where they weren't treated equally to other people because of their race or their religion or ethnicity, at a deep level, they see a connection when they see that millions of Palestinians simply live under the control of a state that doesn't treat them equally.
Well, it's a very good example of what I like to call nonsense liberalism, or liberal manifesting, where you just sort of say shit that is completely disconnected from the reality of the situation. So an example of liberal manifesting is, of course, the Palestinian Authority will have to come in and govern Gaza. Like, with what legitimacy? On what mandate? What are they governing over? The idea of inviting the Palestinian Authority, which is already struggling with its own legitimacy in the West Bank, that they can be imposed by Israel onto Gaza, and that the people of Gaza will be like, yeah, that seems fucking fine, go with that. Crazy, right? It's liberal manifesting. The idea that Hamas, who were elected by the electorate of Gaza in 2006 and 2007, and after a coup against them seized power, was retained power after a long and bloody struggle. The idea that you wouldn't include them in peace negotiations when they are, of course, the very people you have to be making peace with is, again, nonsense liberalism. And when you look at the way in which peace negotiations have carried out, I mean, Alan Dershowitz liked to cite the example of World War II. We're not talking about World War II because we're not talking about the armies of sovereign states. We're talking about a people to whom statehood has been denied. Close-up parallels are much more like, I think, the situation in Northern Ireland, where, of course, the IRA had to be a part of peace negotiations, because if they weren't, what the fuck are you making peace with? And I think that this is something which, because the discourse around Hamas presents them as outside of politics, right? They're just evil, right? The things they do are so depraved, they're just so evil. And this is not, of course, none of this is condoning what happened on October 7th. But the fact is that they are political actors. And bombing Gaza into smithereens is not going to do anything about that simple fact, which is they do have a degree of political legitimacy, having come from an election that was freely held in Gaza, number one. And then number two, of course, increasing numbers of Palestinians are feeling supportive of Hamas and less supportive of the Palestinian Authority and less supportive of a process that involves playing by the rules of Oslo, because look at what Israel have been doing since the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were deeply flawed, right? They were deeply flawed from the start, because you had this idea that you could give Palestine more sovereignty while maintaining an occupation at the same time. You can't do that. You simply can't do that. And then when you see, after Netanyahu takes power, not only is any pretense of Palestinian sovereignty just cast in the bin, you've got the rapid acceleration of settlement expansion. That this is sort of the mainstream of Israeli politics now, because it's not just to do with Likud. Of course, if you're Palestinian, you're not going to have a load of faith in the peace process, which was established by Oslo Accords and then, renewed again at the attempted Camp David summit and later at Taba. I mean, you just wouldn't. And again, this is not to condone, because I don't believe that targeting civilians is okay. I think that's a war crime. I'm not condoning, I'm explaining the context in which these things take place. If you were Palestinian and you've just seen over the last 2 months that your family, perhaps, friends, your people are being bombarded, starved, shot at in Gaza, thousands of children being killed, that thousands have been rounded up in the West Bank and arrested, that You've got videos being circulated of IDF soldiers desecrating Palestinian homes and mosques. How do you think you're going to feel about the idea of revenge? You'd probably want it. You'd probably feel so despairing and so hopeless that the idea of the kind of playing by the rules that's going to get you what you want, that will have nothing for you. So I can really understand why in the West Bank support for Hamas has gone up. It's because what the Israelis have done is, one, kill off any possibility of peaceful negotiations. They refused to negotiate with Hamas back in 2007 in partnership with the Palestinian Authority. They refused to accept that basis for negotiation. And now they're refusing to even countenance the idea that to the political problem that Israel has of trying to maintain the occupation, being a Jewish majority state and a nominal democracy at the same time. Instead of going, well, this is something that needs a political solution. This is going to involve a negotiation with those who have political leadership of the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and of course Hamas. Instead they're like, nah, we'll just kill a load of them and see what happens next. Of course, that completely diminishes the faith of ordinary Palestinians in some kind of diplomatic or political path forward. I wouldn't have faith in that process if I was Palestinian, and I think it's ridiculous to expect any Palestinians to hold to the same tired mantra that we have here in the West, which is there has to be a two-state solution. Of course, there has to be some kind of resolution, but Israel's not interested in a two-state solution. So all of this, just to come back to a phrase that I used in the first half of the show, it's just virtue signaling. It's just virtue signaling at this point to say things like the Palestinian Authority should come back to Gaza, and that's the basis on which negotiations take place. Of course, Hamas can't be there anymore. Of course, Hamas have to be destroyed. Hamas are evil. All of this is just virtue signaling. It's just manifesting. It has no basis in what the reality is for Palestinians that has been created by successive Israeli governments and the Israeli army.
And it feels like the conditions that are being created are, in a sense, to make genocide and ethnic cleansing the only resolution from, the Israelis' perspective and from the perspective that the West seems to be backing. And, when you talk about the kind of how deep the violence of the past 2 months has gone, obviously I don't have statistics for this, but I would be surprised if there were many Palestinians left who weren't 1 degree removed from someone who has been killed, injured, arrested, or, harmed severely in the past 2 months.
First of all, I've said this before, I'm not ready to sign on the dotted line for what Israel is going to do. I am giving them the benefit of the doubt, and I'll predict here today that Israel is not going to starve Gazans to death. But if they do, I will say Finkelstein was right, I was wrong, and this is a shame that the Jewish people committed. I don't believe that's going to happen. I wonder if you really think it's going to happen.
Hello everyone, it's December of 2023. It has been 2 months since the beginning of the Gaza genocide. I am now sadly reporting here on my channel that the starvation of Gaza has begun in earnest. Indeed, these are very dark days. I wanted to begin with a new report from Human Rights Watch, which describes the situation in no uncertain terms. As they put it, the Israeli government is using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in the Gaza Strip, which is a war crime. Israeli forces are deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel. They remind us that this was not an unfortunate, unintended consequence of war, but a plan which was openly stated ad nauseum by Israeli officials. They told us they were going to do this. Following Yoav Gallant's October 9th order to impose a total siege, blocking food, water, fuel, and electricity, Israel Katz, the Israeli energy minister, the one who oversees the supply of energy into Gaza, stated on October 16th, "I strongly oppose the opening of the blockade and the introduction of goods into Gaza on humanitarian grounds. Our commitment is to the families of the murdered and the kidnapped hostages, not to the Hamas murderers and those who aided them." Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security, announced the following day that the only thing that needs to enter Gaza are hundreds of tons of explosives from the Air Force, not an ounce of humanitarian aid. On October 19th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that until the hostages are returned, on December 14th, the World Food Program published a food security update where they reported that more than 85% of the population of Gaza have been displaced. Of these internally displaced persons, or IDPs, nearly all IDP households reported inadequate food consumption, rising from 83% to 93% in just 12 days. Among all Gazans, the numbers are no less staggering. The number of households reporting severe hunger increased from 28% to 56%, an 18-point increase in 12 days. The Christian Science Monitor published a grim article on Gaza's starvation. In it, they quote Deputy Chief of the World Food Program Carl Scow, who, after visiting Gaza, told reporters, "Half the population are starving, 9 out of 10 are not eating enough, not eating every day, and don't know where their next meal is going to come from." They interview a number of Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, including Kifaya al-Kafarna, who stated flatly, "There is nothing available in the markets, no flour, no water, no food. I am glad we have a place to stay, but we can't find anything to eat." Another interviewee, Mohammed Al-Khazar, gives ominous testimony. "This is not a normal war. This is a war that starves you, that stresses you, and pressures you to find food, fuel, and water all day." In previous videos, I've covered how hospitals, water tanks, and bakeries have been directly hit by bombs. Not on accident, apparently, since, according to several Israeli officials, as reported in an investigation by the Israeli 972 magazine, the Israeli army has files on the vast majority of potential targets in Gaza. Targets generated with the use of artificial intelligence. Quoting one source, "Nothing happens by accident. Everything is intentional. We know exactly how much collateral damage there is." Further, the bombing of power targets meaning private residences as well as public buildings, infrastructure, and high-rise blocks, which sources say the army defines as power targets, is mainly intended to harm Palestinian civil society, to create a shock that, among other things, will reverberate powerfully and lead civilians to put pressure on Hamas, as one source put it. Apart from bombing sources of food, water, and sustenance, according to Human Rights Watch, the Israeli army has also been employing bulldozers in an example that can hardly be called unintentional. Since the beginning of the Israeli military's ground offensive on October 27th, satellite imagery reviewed by Human Rights Watch indicates that orchards, greenhouses, and farmland in northern Gaza have been razed. The razing of agricultural land continued in northern Gaza during the 7-day ceasefire, which began on November 24th and ended on December 1st, when the Israeli military was in direct control of the area.
We have Brianna Joy Gray versus Alan Dershowitz on the Hill. These are two lawyers going at it, and Brianna does a very, very good job of being a good lawyer at just totally dismantling this guy and exposing him for just a rank liar. You'll see what I'm saying. So he starts out, his audio, not ours, his audio on the initial stream cut out when he starts out by making the point, look, I don't equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but an organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, he claims, is some sort of AstroTurf group for anti-Semites to hide under the Jewish banner.
Yeah, with all Goyim. It's all Goyim with a few token Jews that they push out front, according to Dershowitz.
According to
Which
Dershowitz.
he offers no evidence of at all.
No, none. And she can sniff that out, which is why you'll just see a very, very thorough and effective,
She was very good,
piece by piece dismantling of what this idiot is trying to lie about. And that's what he's doing. He's lying, and she exposes that. So let's give this a look.
Zionism with anti-Zionism. I do equate support for Hamas with anti-Semitism. Jewish Voice for Peace supports Hamas. They praise Hamas. They think the rapes and the murders were good things. And the National Lawyers Guild praised Hamas. And 33 Jewish groups at Harvard, groups at Harvard praised Hamas. Praising Hamas is anti-Semitic.
Can you provide a citation, Professor Dershowitz, for that proposition that Jewish Voice for Peace praised Hamas?
You're dominating this conversation. You're going to let me finish. I am in favor of a two-state solution. I have been critical.
She asked the question. She's the interviewer. She's doing her job. She's not dominating the conversation. Bear in mind, this guy has written books on this topic. He's been speaking out about this topic for decades. He had a big dust-up, famously, with Norman Finkelstein over this. This guy has really taken this up as a cause of his staunch support for the Israeli state, and he has no arguments and no facts to support what he's saying. It just shows what a house of cards the whole Zionist argument has been the whole time. That when this guy is challenged, he has absolutely nothing, as we'll see.
Of Israel. I am a Zionist. I don't believe that anti-Zionism is necessarily equatable to anti-Semitism, but it often is when you combine it with pro-Hamas sentiments and support for butchery and murder. Yes, then it becomes anti-Semitism.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I would like to ask if you have I apologize for that, Professor Dershowitz, so perhaps you could provide a citation for the proposition that Jewish Voice for Peace praised Hamas, in your words. That's a very specific allegation for a Jewish group that I am very familiar with, have interviewed with at length, and have never seen any evidence of the like.
Book in my book, and the quotations and the statements that were made and the signs that were held up at Jewish for Peace demonstrations have praised Hamas, have supported Hamas, and they're fooling you. They're sending you the 6 Jews in the organization to fool you. They're not sending you the hundreds of radical socialist non-Jews who formed this revolutionary group that really, in the end, wants to overthrow the government of the United States. And they were very clever. They used Jewish Voice for Peace to pretend that Jews somehow support Hamas. And
okay, stop for 1 second. When we did the segment on... When we did the segment where Jewish Voice for Peace shut down Grand Central Terminal, you saw, there were a couple thousand people in Jewish Voice for Peace shirts, who were members. You think they were faking? You think those are imposters? You think those are Gentile imposters who are wearing those T-shirts? What do you mean? 6, I know that's a figure of speech. But what he's saying is it's a majority non-Jewish organization.
They're mostly migrants.
Right, that's posted as a Jewish organization. What a ridiculous charge, and no, at any point, evidence to back that up. Do you have anything else to add before we finish this? We have a couple more minutes.
No, he's full of shit, because if he had an iota of evidence, when you make a claim like this, if you have evidence, it's what you lead with.
Right, you lead with it.
Right? That's putting your foot on the person's neck. And he's a lawyer. If he had an iota of evidence, you'd hear it. It also tells you, because Dershowitz, I'm sure, is not on his own, these Zionists have to formulate some kind of a response to the way that a group like Jewish Voice for Peace creates daylight between Zionism and Judaism. They can't let that stand. So they do what Israel does. They just lie. They just make shit up, and they rely on a hitherto incurious media to let them dominate the narrative, but that hasn't been working for them as well this time around.
But I would like to introduce him as an Indian boxer who often likes to throw punches at the empire. He's been known to be, I would say, quite saucy when it comes to talking about the US imperialism, and questions those who put an S at the end of that word. I'm honored to welcome Comrade Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research.
Good evening. Nice to be with you. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Those incredible habits of colonialism, that finger wagging, it's amazing. Joe Biden, Obama, Trump, I forgot, Bush, Clinton, and so on. They seem to go to school somewhere where they learn to wag their finger. They can't talk to us without wagging their finger, telling us how to behave. When I listen to them speak, including Emmanuel Macron and Liz Truss, even the Queen of England met Liz Truss and died. Within hours of meeting her, she couldn't take it anymore. They seem to have this habit of speaking to us like that. And sometimes when I listen to them speak like that, I feel like that little boy in shorts, infantilized, old colonial habits. Anytime we stand up and say we're people, we're human beings as well, we have plans, we have projects, they say, sit down, listen to us. Such a pleasure today to listen to our comrades, Comrade Carlos, Comrade Bruno, from the great revolutionary experiments and processes in Venezuela and Cuba. So great to finally listen to world leaders who are adults. So great to listen to our comrades Claudia and Kristen. And you know what? Let me tell you something. When I say that they have this habit of wagging their fingers, I also want to say they're deeply mediocre people. You know, Joe Biden is a deeply mediocre man. There's something deeply unsettling about how mediocre the leaders of the United States are. I mean, look at Ted Cruz. What is this? Who are these people? And in a way, it's the people of the United States that's failing themselves. When you have the possibility of electing Claudia and Kristen to be your president and vice president, instead of amazing people like this, you send Joe Biden to what they call the White House. When they're the presidents, it'll be called the People's House. The House of White Supremacy. The White Supremacy House. Joe Biden wagging his fingers, telling everybody how to live, claiming the word democracy for themselves. Who gave them the right to claim the word democracy? Democracy is our word. Who gave them the right to destroy the word human with their propagandic phrase, human rights? Human rights is our word. That's our phrase. They shouldn't sully these words in their mouths. Democracy. What democracy? What democracy? The democracy of money. The democracy of money. Buying elections. Bribing politicians. That's this democracy. How can you claim to be a democracy when you have people who are hungry in your country? How can you claim to be a democracy when you have people who are hungry in your country? How is that a democracy? What kind of perversion makes you say democracy when you allow people to be hungry, when you allow them to have no houses, when you allow them to take refuge in cocaine, and then you go and bomb Colombia? What gives you the right to use the word democracy? Next year is the 200th anniversary. 200 years. It's the 200th anniversary of the dreaded Monroe Doctrine. 200 years ago, the United States decided that it owns the Americas. And by the way, it was not just a speech made by James Monroe. Shortly thereafter, the United States conducted a war of aggression. Did you hear Biden say the United States never conducted a war of aggression? Mediocre. Mediocre. Lying about his own history. I know his history better than him. Mediocre. Unimpressive. Lying about his history. He says, just a few decades after the Monroe Doctrine, the United States, in an aggressive war against Mexico, seizes almost half the territory of Mexico. Then they call them California and so on. Occupied Mexico. When is Mexico going to claim that land back? When is that going to be back on the table? And then coup d'etat after coup d'etat after coup d'etat. From Guatemala to Brazil to Chile, Operation Condor. How many governments have you overthrown today, Joe? How many governments have you overthrown today, Joe? How many illegal, aggressive wars have you sanctioned, Joe? Did you vote to illegally bomb and destroy Iraq, Joe? Did you bomb illegally Libya and destroy that country, Joe? What are you doing today, Joe? Mediocre. Destroying the world and calling that democracy. That is not democracy. That is a perversion of the idea of democracy. The Monroe Doctrine, next year, 200 years. When is this country going to grow up? When is this country going to grow up? When is this country going to recognize that it actually is not a country on the hill? Give it up. You're just ordinary people. You're just people. You're just like the Mexicans. You're just like the Cubans. You're just like the Venezuelans. Relax. There's nothing special about the United States. Relax, guys. Relax. Relax. Take it easy. You'll have a lot less stress. Relax. You don't need a Monroe Doctrine. You don't need a global Monroe Doctrine. We don't need global NATO. We don't need US warships in the South China Sea. We don't need that. We don't need any of that. We don't want war. We want peace. Let me tell you something strange that I just learned recently, and I'm embarrassed to say I just learned it recently. I know that the United States spends almost $1 trillion every year on war making. Almost $1 trillion. But do you know what the budget of the United Nations is? Do you know what the budget of the United Nations? United Nations is supposed to be an institution, a global institution to build peace. The United Nations annual budget, my friends, is $3 billion. $3 billion to build peace, $1 trillion just by the United States to produce war. You can't eat in this country. You can't find a house to live in this country. You can't go to school and study without going to debt in this country. but you can bomb any country in the world. Well done. Well done, guys. Great. The greatest country in the world is the greatest country, not because there's no hunger in it, but because you can destroy any other country in the world. Well done. Those are your values. The values of a country are not to be measured by its constitution. The values of a country are to be measured by its budget. And the United States spends half its budget trying to destroy the world. It spends half its money trying to destroy the world and then wags the finger and talks about democracy. Do you see how strange this looks from outside the United States? Do you see how weird this is? People look at this and think, who's this guy Biden? This is crazy. He's mediocre. He's wagging his finger. He's telling us about democracy. And right outside my window is a warship that's ready to destroy my family. Bizarre. It's bizarre and uncomfortable and painful. I'm speaking to you on behalf of another process. You see, we don't want to deal with humanity as a security problem, as a problem that requires war, as a problem that requires policing. There are real dilemmas of humanity. Those dilemmas of humanity need to be transcended with a politics of love. Socialism is a politics of love. Socialism is not about hate. It's not about fear. Socialism is about love. These mediocre imperialists fear love. They promote hate. They promote hatred. They don't understand love. They don't understand compassion. They don't know what it means to stay awake every night trying to make sure everybody's got something to eat. They don't understand that. I'm speaking to you from the process called the International People's Assembly. We are about 500 political, social organizations around the world. What we're committed to is expanding our ranks. We want to build our movements. You see, the point for us, and this is where we live by observing, accompanying, amplifying revolutionary developments in Venezuela and Cuba. We amplify, we accompany, we learn from, because we understand the point is not to criticize mediocrity alone. What's the point of being obsessed with them? The real question is, what are we doing? Are we going to the people and saying, look at them, they're so terrible? No, that's not going to lift anybody up. We go to the people and say, this is what we want to do. We want to build. We want to build with love. We want socialism. You see, my friends, many years ago, my great hero, Ho Chi Minh, he's a great hero of mine, and if you clap for him, I'll be really happy. To Comrade Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, we will fight, we will win. Some Italian communists came to see Ho Chi Minh the year before he died. And as with many people, they came to offer their solidarity with the struggle of the Vietnamese against the imperialist war machine. I know you've experienced this kind of solidarity because people came to Ho Chi Minh and they said, what can we do to help the Vietnamese revolution? That's a sincere question coming from these Italian comrades. They met Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi, and if you know anything about Ho Chi Minh's life, he lived in a very humble hut right through his life. He met people there. He would take out from his pocket, I don't have one here, he would twirl a cigarette around, you know. And he used to always say, my one concession to US imperialism is I like Lucky Strikes. So very sincerely, these Italian comrades said to him, how do we help the revolution in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, smiling at them, said, go home and make a revolution. Ho Chi Minh said, go home and make a revolution. Comrades, friends, comrades, listen to me. It's one thing for us to come to our comrades from Venezuela and Cuba and say, we're with you, comrades. La lucha sigue. It's one thing for us to say, we're with you. Chavez vive, Fidel. It's one thing to say, we stand with you. And it's another thing for you to say, I'm gonna get this mediocre shit out of my life. I'm gonna get this mediocre shit out of my life. You have to build power. We want to win.
The skies over Gaza are filled with projectiles of death. Attack helicopters, drones, artillery shells, tank shells, mortars, bombs, missiles. Gaza is a cacophony of explosions and forlorn screams and cries for help beneath collapsed buildings. Fear, after the 7-day truce, is coiling itself again around every heart in the Gazan concentration camp. Over 16,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including over 6,000 children, have been killed since October 7th, with another 42,000 wounded. More than 1.8 million people, over 80% of Gaza's population, have been driven from their homes. Thousands are missing, buried under the rubble. More than 300 families have lost 10 or more members. Nearly 300 Palestinians at the same time have been killed in the West Bank and over 3,000 wounded. Israel will not be deterred. It plans to finish the job, to obliterate what is left in the north of Gaza and decimate what remains in the south, to render Gaza uninhabitable, to see its 2.3 million people driven out in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing via starvation, terror, slaughter, and infectious diseases. The aid convoys bring in token amounts of food and medicine. The first batch during the pause were shrouds and coronavirus tests. The Biden administration refuses to set conditions that will disrupt the $3.8 billion Israel receives in annual military assistance and the $14.3 billion in supplemental aid. It mutters useless bromides about surgical strikes while Israel spins its roulette wheel of death. By the time Israel is done, the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, where thousands of Palestinians were massacred in dozens of villages and 750,000 were ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias, will look like a quaint relic of a more civilized era. Nothing is off limits. Hospitals, ambulances, mosques, churches, homes, apartment blocks, refugee camps, schools, universities, media offices, sewer systems, telecommunications, infrastructure, water treatment plants, libraries, wheat mills, bakeries, markets, entire neighborhoods. Israel's intent is to destroy Gaza's infrastructure, to make Gaza a wasteland, a dead zone that will be incapable of sustaining life. A leaked 10-page document from the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence dated October 13, 2013 calls for the forcible and permanent transfer of the Gaza's 2.3 million Palestinian residents to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. once Palestinians cross the border into Egypt, which the Egyptian government and Arab leaders are seeking to prevent despite pressure from the U.S., Palestinians will never return. This is not a war against Hamas. It is a war against Palestinians. Israeli strikes are generated at a dizzying rate, many of them from a system called HASBARA, the gospel, which is built on artificial intelligence that selects 100 targets a day. The AI system is described on the Israeli sites Plus 972 magazine and Local Call as facilitating, I quote, a mass assassination factory. Israel, once it locates what it assumes to be a Hamas operative from a cell phone, for example, bombs and shells a wide area around the target, killing and wounding dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Israel has abandoned its tactic of roof knocking, where a rocket without a warhead lands on top of a building to warn those inside to evacuate. It has also ended its phone calls warning of an impending attack. Now dozens of families in an apartment block or a neighborhood are killed without notice. During the siege in Sarajevo, when I was reporting for the New York Times, we never endured the level of saturation bombing and near total blockage of food, water, fuel, and medicine that Israel has imposed on Gaza. We never endured hundreds of dead a day and wounded a day. We never endured the complicity of the international community in the Serbian campaign of genocide. We never endured Washington intervening to block a ceasefire resolution. We never endured massive arms shipments from the US and other Western countries to sustain the siege. We never endured press reports from Sarajevo that were routinely discredited and dismissed by the international community, although 25 journalists were killed in the war by the besieging Serbian forces. We never endured Western governments justifying the siege as the right of the Serbs to defend themselves, although UN peacekeepers sent to Bosnia were largely a public relations gesture, ineffective in halting the slaughter, until forced to respond following the massacres of 8,000 Bosniak men and boys at Srebrenica. I don't mean to minimize the horror of the siege in Sarajevo, which gives me nightmares nearly 3 decades later. But what we suffered, 300 to 400 shells a day, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, is a tiny fraction of the wholesale death and destruction in Gaza. The Israeli siege of Gaza more resembles the Wehrmacht's assault on Stalingrad, where over 90% of the city's buildings were destroyed, than Sarajevo. Israel's goal is to erase not only a people, but the idea of Palestine. It is a carbon copy of the massive campaigns of racialized slaughter by other settler colonial projects that believe that indiscriminate and wholesale violence could make the aspirations of an oppressed people whose land they stole go away. And like other perpetrators of genocide, Israel intends to keep it hidden, locking out foreign reporters and photographers, cutting phone and internet service. And it has targeted Palestinian reporters, my colleagues, for assassination, killing over 50. Israel has dropped more than 25,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, nearly the equivalent of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Gaza, by the end of Israel's scorched earth campaign, will be uninhabitable, a tactic the Nazis regularly employed when facing armed resistance, including in the Warsaw Ghetto and later Warsaw itself. Gaza or at least Gaza as we knew it, will not exist. Not only are the tactics the same, but so is the rhetoric. Palestinians are referred to as animals, beasts. They have no right to exist. Their children have no right to exist. They must be cleansed from the earth. The extermination of those whose land we steal, whose resources we plunder, and whose labor we exploit is coded within the DNA of industrialized nations. Ask Native Americans. Ask Indians. Ask the Congolese. Ask the Kikuyu in Kenya. Ask the Herero in Namibia, who, like the Palestinians in Gaza, were gunned down and driven into desert concentration camps where they died of starvation and disease. 80,000 of them. Ask Iraqis, ask Afghans, ask Syrians, ask Kurds, ask Libyans, ask indigenous peoples across the globe. They know who we are. Israel's distorted, settler colonial visage is our own. We pretend otherwise. We ascribe to ourselves virtues and civilizing qualities that are, as in Israel, flimsy justifications for stripping an occupied and besieged people of their rights, seizing their land, and using prolonged imprisonment, torture, humiliation, enforced poverty, and murder to keep them subjugated. Our past, including our recent past in the Middle East, is built on the idea of subduing or wiping out the inferior races of the earth. We give these inferior races names that embody evil: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas. We used racist slurs to dehumanize them: Haji, sand, the N-word, camel jockey, Alibaba, dung shoveler. And then, because they embody evil, because they are less than human, we feel licensed, as Nissam Vatouri, a member of the Israeli parliament for the ruling Likud party, said, to erase the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Naftali Bennett, Israel's former prime minister, said, quote, "We're fighting Nazis." In other words, absolute evil. Not to be outdone, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described Hamas in a press conference with the German chancellor as the new Nazis. Think about that. A people imprisoned in the world's largest concentration camp for 16 years, denied food, water, fuel, and medicine, lacking an army, air force, navy, mechanized units, artillery, command and control, and missile batteries, is being butchered and starved by one of the most advanced militaries on the planet, and they are the Nazis. There is an historical analogy here, but it is not one that Bennett, Netanyahu, or any other Israeli leader wants to acknowledge. When those who are occupied refuse to submit, when they continue to resist, we drop all pretense of our civilizing mission and unleash, as in Gaza, an orgy of slaughter and destruction. We become drunk on violence. We kill with reckless ferocity. We become the beasts we accuse the oppressed of being. We expose the lie of our vaunted moral superiority. We expose the fundamental truth about Western civilization. We are the most ruthless and efficient killers on the planet. This alone is why we dominate the wretched of the earth. It has nothing to do with democracy or freedom or liberty. These are rights we never intend to grant to the oppressed. Honor, justice, compassion, and freedom are ideas that have no converts, Joseph Conrad reminds us. There are only people without knowing, understanding, or feelings who intoxicate themselves with words, repeat words, shout them out, imagining they believe them, without believing in anything else but profit, personal advantage, and their own satisfaction. Genocide lies at the core of Western imperialism. It is not unique to Israel. It is not unique to the Nazis. It is the building block of Western domination. The humanitarian interventionists who insist we should bomb and occupy other nations because we embody goodness, although they promote military intervention only when it is perceived to be in our national interest, are the useful idiots of the war machine and global imperialists. They live in an Alice in Wonderland fairy tale where the rivers of blood we spawn make the world a happier and better place. They are the smiley faces of genocide. You can watch them on your screens. You can listen to them spout their pseudo-morality in the White House and in Congress. They're always wrong, and they never go away. Israel, like all settler colonial projects, including our own, was founded on lies. The lie that Palestinian land was unoccupied. The lie that 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes and villages during the ethnic cleansing by Zionist militias in 1948 because they were told to do so by their leaders. The lie that it was Arab armies that started the 1948 war, that saw Israel seize 78% of historic Palestine. The lie that Israel faced annihilation in 1967, forcing it to invade and occupy the remaining 22% of Palestine as well as land belonging to Egypt and Syria. Israel is sustained by lies. The lie that Israel wants a just and equitable peace and will support an independent Palestinian state. The lie that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. The lie that Israel is an outpost of Western civilization in a sea of barbarism. The lie that Israel respects the rule of law and human rights. The brazenness of Israeli lies stunned those of us who reported from Gaza. It did not matter if we had seen the Israeli attack, including the shooting of unarmed Palestinians. It did not matter how many witnesses we interviewed. It did not matter what photographic and forensic evidence we obtained. Israel lied. Small lies, big lies, huge lies. These lies came reflexively and instantly from the Israeli military, Israeli politicians, and Israeli media. They were amplified by Israel's well-oiled propaganda machine and repeated with a cloying sincerity on international news outlets. Israel engages in the kinds of jaw-dropping lies that characterize despotic regimes. It does not deform the truth. It inverts it. It paints a picture that is diametrically opposed to reality. Those of us who have covered the occupied territories have run into Israel's Alice in Wonderland narratives, which we dutifully insert into our stories, required under the rules of American journalism, although we know they are untrue. Israel has invented an Orwellian lexicon. Children killed by Israelis become children caught in the crossfire. The bombing of residential districts with dozens of dead and wounded becomes a surgical strike on a bomb-making factory. The destruction of Palestinian homes becomes the demolition of the homes of terrorists. The big lie feeds the two reactions Israel seeks to elicit: racism among its supporters and terror among its victims. The big lie fosters the myth of a clash of civilizations, a war between democracy, decency, and honor on one side, and Islamic terrorism, barbarism, and medievalism on the other. The big lie abolishes nuances, ambiguities, and contradictions that can plague conscience. It is designed to create cognitive dissonance. It permits no gray zones. The world is black and white, good and evil, righteous and unrighteous. The big lie allows believers to take comfort, a comfort they are desperately seeking, in their own moral superiority. It feeds what Edward Bernays called the logic-proof compartment of dogmatic adherence. All effective propaganda, Bernays writes, targets and builds upon these irrational psychological habits. Israel's supporters do not want to know the truth. The truth would force them to examine their racism, self-delusion, and complicity in oppression, murder, and genocide. Most important, the big lie sends an ominous message to the Palestinians. The big lie states that Israel will wage a campaign of mass terror and genocide and never take responsibility for its crimes. The big lie obliterates the truth. It obliterates the dignity of human thought and human action. It obliterates facts. It obliterates history. It obliterates comprehension. It obliterates hope. It reduces all communication to the language of violence. When oppressors speak to the oppressed exclusively through indiscriminate violence, the oppressed answer through indiscriminate violence. I and the public know what all school children learn, W.H. Auden wrote. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. The cartoonist Joe Sacco and I watched Israeli soldiers taunt and shoot small boys in Khan Yunis in Gaza. We interviewed the boys and their parents afterwards in the hospital. In a few cases, we attended the funerals. We had their names, we had the dates, we had the locations of the shootings. Israel's response was to say that we were not in Gaza. We had made it up. The Israeli Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, and IDF spokesman immediately blamed the killing of my AlJazeera colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh, in 2022 on Palestinian gunmen. Israel disseminated footage of a Palestinian fighter they said shot and killed the journalist who was wearing a flak jacket and helmet marked press. The lie was peddled until video footage examined by B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, identified the location of the Palestinian gunman depicted in the video. The video the Human Rights Organization found was taken in a different location from where Shireen was killed. When Israel is caught lying, as it was with the murder of Shireen, it promises an investigation. But these investigations are a sham. Impartial investigations into the thousands of killings by soldiers and Jewish settlers of Palestinians are rarely carried out. Perpetrators are almost never brought to trial or held accountable. The pattern of Israeli obfuscation is predictable, and so is the collusion of nearly all the corporate media, along with Republican and Democratic politicians. U.S. politicians decried the murder of Shireen and dutifully repeated the old mantra calling for a thorough investigation by the army that carried out the crime. A few months later, Israel admitted that there was a, quote, high possibility that an Israeli soldier killed Shireen by accident. But by then, the eruption of street protests in the West Bank and rage over the killing of the journalist was over, and her murder largely forgotten. There is dramatic footage captured in September 2000 at the Netzarim Junction in Gaza, where I saw a 19-year-old boy shot and killed by an Israeli sniper, by France 2, of a father trying to shield his traumatized 12-year-old son, Mohammed al-Dara, from Israeli gunfire that ultimately killed him. The killing of the boy resulted in the typical propaganda campaign by Israel. Israeli officials spent years lying about the killing, first blaming the Palestinians for the shooting, later suggesting the scene was faked, and finally insisting the boy was still alive. When an Israeli soldier in 2003 murdered the 23-year-old student and American activist Rachel Corrie by crushing her to death with a bulldozer as she tried to prevent the illegal demolition of a Palestinian doctor's home, the Israeli army said it was an accident for which Corrine was responsible. Israel blocks the work of independent human rights organizations into atrocities and war crimes it commits in Gaza and the West Bank. It refuses to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. It does not cooperate with the UN Human Rights Council. It prohibits the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestinian territories occupied from 1967 from entering the country. Israel revoked the work permit for Omar Shakir, director of Human Rights Watch, in 2018 and expelled him. In May 2018, Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Public Diplomacy published a report calling on the European Union and European states to halt their direct and indirect financial support and funding to Palestinian and international human rights organizations that, quote, have ties to terror and promote boycotts against Israel. And Israel refused a few days ago to renew a visa for Lynn Hastings, the top UN humanitarian aid official for Gaza and the West Bank. The longer the genocide continues, the more absurd the lies become. There are big lies, the obliteration of Gaza and wanton killing of thousands of Palestinians. Israel insists is a targeted effort to get rid of Hamas. And there are small lies, 40 beheaded babies. Al-Shifa Hospital is a Hamas command center. A calendar in Arabic on the wall, according to the IDF spokesman, is a guard list where every terrorist writes his name and every terrorist has his own shift guarding the people that were here. An Israeli actor dressed up as a nurse and speaking heavily accented Arabic claims to be a Palestinian and to have seen Hamas use civilians as human shields. She says of Hamas that they attacked Al-Shifa Hospital and stole the fuel and medicine. Palestinian militants, rather than Israeli tanks, Israel claims, are responsible for the shelling of Al-Shifa. An Israeli car, or Israel struck a car full of terrorists in southern Lebanon, terrorists who turned out to be 3 girls, their mother and grandmother. The explosion at Al-Ahli Hospital was the result of an errant rocket fired by the Palestinians, a claim even the New York Times questioned when it discredited the video based on an analysis of its timestamp. Israel said it responded to the request of the director of Shifa Hospital to allow Gazan citizens who were sheltering in the hospital and who wished to evacuate from Shifa Hospital towards the humanitarian crossing in Gaza Strip via a secure access. This was a statement that Mohammed Zakut, the director of the hospitals in Gaza, said was categorically false, adding, quote, "We were forced to leave by gunpoint." The lies will be written into Israeli school books. The lies will be repeated by Israeli politicians, historians, and journalists. The lies will be told on Israeli television and in Israeli films and books. Israelis are the eternal victims. Palestinians are absolute evil. There was no genocide. Turkey, a century later, still denies what happened to the Armenians. The lies create cognitive dissonance where fact becomes fiction, fiction becomes truth. The lies make any discussion of genocide and ultimately reconciliation impossible. And Israel, like the perpetrators of past genocides, will pretend it never happened. But the lies used by Israel to absolve itself of responsibility will eat away at Israeli society. They will corrode its moral, religious, civic, intellectual, and political life. The lies will elevate war criminals to heroic status and demonize those with a conscience. Israel's genocide, as with the 1965 mass killings in Indonesia, will be mythologized, an epic battle against the forces of evil, just as we mythologize the genocide of Native Americans and turn our own settlers and murderous cavalry units into heroes. I covered the birth of Jewish fascism in Israel. I reported on the extremist Meir Kahane, who was barred from running for office and whose Koch party was outlawed in 1994. and declared a terrorist organization by Israel and the United States. I attended political rallies by Netanyahu, who received lavish funding from right-wing Americans when he ran against Yitzhak Rabin, who was negotiating a peace settlement with the Palestinians. Netanyahu's supporters chanted, "Death to Rabin." They burned an effigy of Rabin, dressed in a Nazi uniform. Netanyahu marched in front of a mock funeral for Rabin. Rabin was assassinated on November 4th, 1995, by a Jewish fanatic. And Rabin's widow, Leah, blamed Netanyahu and his supporters for her husband's murder. Netanyahu, who first became prime minister in 1996, has spent his political career nurturing Jewish extremists, including Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Sa'ar, Naftali Bennett. Netanyahu's father, Ben-Zion, who worked as an assistant to the Zionist pioneer Vladimir Jabotinsky, who Benito Mussolini referred to as a good fascist, was a leader in the Herut Party that called on the Jewish state to seize all the land of historic Palestine. Many of those who formed the Herut Party carried out terrorist attacks during the 1948 war that established the State of Israel. Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Sidney Hook, and other Jewish intellectuals described the Herut Party in a statement published in the New York Times as, quote, "a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to Nazi and fascist parties." There has always been a strain of Jewish fascism within the Zionist project. Now it has taken control of the State of Israel. The left is no longer capable of overcoming the toxic ultra-nationalism that has evolved here. Zev Sternhill, a Holocaust survivor and Israel's foremost authority on fascism, warned in 2018. The kind whose European strain almost wiped out a majority of the Jewish people. Sternhill added, "We see not just a growing Israeli fascism, but racism, akin to Nazism in its early stages." The decision to obliterate Gaza has long been the dream of Israel's crypto-fascist heirs of Kahana's movement. They champion the iconography and language of their homegrown fascism. Jewish identity and Jewish nationalism are the Zionist versions of blood and soil. Jewish supremacy is sanctified by God, as is the slaughter of Palestinians, who Netanyahu compared to the biblical Ammonites massacred by the Israelites. It is a grave mistake not to take the blood-curdling calls for the wholesale eradication and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians seriously. This rhetoric is not hyperbolic. It is a literal prescription. Palestinians, for the Israeli state, function as little more than human laboratory rats. The Israeli military, intelligence services, arms, and technology industries, and Israel's drones and surveillance technology, including spyware, facial recognition, software, biometric gathering infrastructure, along with smart fences, experimental bombs, AI-controlled machine guns, they're all tried out on the captive population in Gaza, often with lethal results. These weapons and technologies are then certified as, quote, battle-tested and sold around the world. Israel is the 10th biggest arms dealer on the planet. It sells its technology and weapons to an estimated 130 nations, including military dictatorships in Asia and Latin America. Israeli weapons sales totaled $12.5 billion last year. Its close relationship with these military, internal security, surveillance, and intelligence gathering and law enforcement agencies explains the fulsome support Israel's allies give to the genocide in Gaza. When Colombian President Gustavo Petro refused to condemn the October 7th attack by Palestinian resistance groups as a terrorist attack and said, quote, terrorism is killing innocent children in Palestine, Israel immediately halted all sales of defense and security equipment to Colombia. This global cabal, dedicated to permanent war and keeping its populations monitored and controlled, has hundreds of billions of dollars a year in sales. These technologies are cementing into place a supranational corporate totalitarianism, a world where populations are enslaved in ways that past totalitarian regimes could only imagine. The genocide in Gaza is another chapter in the century-long ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians by the Israeli settler colonial project. It is accompanied, as is true for all settler colonial projects, by the theft of natural resources, land, water, and the natural gas in the Gaza marine fields 20 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza, which could contain up to 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In a world of diminishing resources, especially water in the Middle East, and the dislocations caused by the climate crisis, Gaza is the prelude to a frightening new world order. As democracies wither and die, as economic inequality expands, as poverty and desperation mounts, the global ruling class will increasingly do to us, once we become restive or attempt to rebel, what they are doing to the Palestinians. It is not a far cry from Gaza to the camps and detention centers set up for migrants fleeing to Europe, from Africa and the Middle East, or from the global south to the United States. It is not a far cry from the carpet bombing in Gaza to the endless wars in the Middle East and the global south. It is not a far cry from the anti-terrorism laws used to criminalize dissent in Israel to the anti-terrorism laws introduced in Europe and the US. Israel has long supplied some of the most heinous regimes on the planet with weaponry, including the apartheid government of South Africa and Myanmar. India is Israel's largest purchaser of military drones. Israel provided UAVs, missiles, and mortars to Azerbaijan for its invasion and occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh, which displaced 100,000 people, more than 80% of the enclave's ethnic Armenians. Israel sold napalm and weapons to the Salvadoran military, as well as the murderous regime of Rios Montt in Guatemala when I covered the wars in the 1980s in Central America. Israeli-made Uzi submachine guns were the weapons of choice for Central American death squads. Israel also sold weapons to the Bosnian Serbs, despite international sanctions, when I covered the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. Elbit Systems, Israel's largest private weapons firm, supplies U.S. Customs and Border Protection with high-tech surveillance towers, which it uses along the border with Mexico. It also supplied the CBP with its Hermes drone from 2004 in order to test the feasibility of using them on the border with Mexico. Pegasus, a phone hacking tool produced by the Israeli NSO Group, a cyber intelligence agency, has been used by Mexican drug cartels to target journalists and track down the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was a friend of mine, and then it was killed and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October 2018. Pegasus transforms a cellular phone into a mobile surveillance device with microphones and cameras activated without the user's knowledge. Skunk water, a putrid-smelling liquid, was tested on Palestinians, often with Israeli film crews recording the attacks to show potential clients, including U.S. police departments, the effectiveness of the chemical. Israel created a sophisticated facial recognition system, Red Wolf, to document every Palestinian in the occupied territories. Israel trains and equips U.S. police forces, teaching aggressive tactics backed up by heavy military hardware and vehicles, which were used in Ferguson and Atlanta during the police confrontations with activists who are protesting Cop City. This new world begins in Gaza, but it ends at home. The zealots in power in Israel could have exchanged the hostages held by Hamas for the thousands of Palestinian hostages held in Israeli prisons, which is why the Israeli hostages were seized. And there is evidence that in the chaotic fighting that took place once Hamas militants entered Israel, the Israeli military decided to target not only Hamas fighters, but the Israeli captives with them. Several new testimonies by Israeli witnesses to the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel adds to the growing evidence that the Israeli military killed its own citizens as they fought to neutralize Palestinian gunmen, Max Blumenthal writes in the Gray Zone. Tuval Escapa, a member of the security team for Kibbutz Beria, set up a hotline to coordinate between kibbutz residents and the Israeli army. He told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that as desperation began to set in, quote, the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate the terrorists along with the hostages. The newspaper reported that Israeli commanders were, quote, compelled to request an airstrike against its own facility inside the Erez crossing to Gaza in, quote, in order to repulse the terrorists who had seized control. The base housed Israeli civil administration, officers, and soldiers. Israel in 1986 introduced a military policy called the Hannibal Directive, apparently named for the Carthaginian general who poisoned himself rather than be captured by the Romans. Following the capture of 2 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah, the directive is designed to prevent Israeli troops from falling into enemy hands through the maximum use of force, even at the cost of killing the captured soldiers and civilians. The directive was executed during the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza, known as Operation Protective Edge. Hamas fighters on August 1st, 2014, captured an Israeli officer, Lieutenant Hadar Golden. In response, Israel dropped more than 2,000 bombs, missiles, and shells on the area where he was being held. Golden was killed, along with over 100 Palestinian civilians. The directive was supposedly rescinded in 2016, but I'm nearly certain it is being applied to the 138 remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza.
Hi, I'm Palestinian from Palestine, and I'm asking people why they are here supporting Palestine. Can I ask you?
I don't think I'm the right person.
Why?
I don't think it's going to be good.
Whatever from the heart.
Okay.
So why are you supporting? Why are you here today at the march?
Because I believe in the liberation of all people, and I think it's very important that we stand here with them so that they know that they're not alone, and that they know that they're not, surviving all by themselves. I think it's important that people around the world stand up with them, and it's kind of the only thing that we can do.
Thank you for that. That's
yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. What's your name?
Elodie.